Hello, writers. Welcome to the London Writers Salon. We are Matt and Parl. We're your hosts for today's interview. We're also the co-founders of the London Writers Salon. And our salon interviews are a chance for us to go behind the scenes of a writer's journey and dig into the stories behind the stories. And so each week we invite to the salon a writer that we admire to explore the craft of writing, the art of building a writing career, and the reality of navigating the creative world.
And today, our guest is the one and only Seth Godin. Seth is the author of 20 international bestsellers that have changed the way people think about work. They've been translated into 39 languages. And among his vast array of books, we have This is Marketing, Purple Cow, Tribes, The Dip, Linchpin, Hook the Box, and All Marketeer Lies. And some of his latest books include The Practice and The Song of Significance. Seth is known for writing one of the most popular blogs in the world, and he is, of course, the founder of the Alt MBA.
And so today we're going to speak to Seth about his writing journey spanning dozens of projects, 20 books, over 8,000 blog posts. We're going to talk about his creative process, his philosophy on building a writing practice, and we're also going to talk about some of the wonderful ideas in his best-selling books. Parl and I, we've prepared a bunch of questions for Seth, and thank you to everyone who submitted your questions ahead of time. We tried to embed those into our questions. We're not sure we're going to have a chance for audience questions at the end, but if you do have a question throughout this conversation, you're welcome to put it in the chat, and we might have a chance to circle around to it at the end. All right. Well, without further ado, welcome to the London Writers Salon, Seth Godin.
Well, thank you. Thank you. That was a great ado. We don't need more of it, but it was good ado. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Seth. This has been a long time dream of ours, and we're so honored to have you here in the room with us. First, we just want to thank you on behalf of us, on behalf of this entire community. You've been so influential, whether people in this room know it or not. Your ideas pulse through the veins of this organization and this community. It's influenced how we listen, how we build, how we show up, how we take responsibility. So thank you on behalf of all of us first.
It's a privilege. And again, if I can teach people who teach other people, that's a good day.
Thank you, Seth. So we'd love to kick off with your origin story around how you came to write for Fast Company magazine. And we thought that this not only embeds some of your philosophy that infuses your work, but also I think it says a lot to who Seth Godin is and your way of showing up in the world. And you're welcome to take that however you like, but could you tell us the story about how you came to write for Fast Company?
Well, I'll start 20 years before that. When I was in high school, I was pretty much determined that I did not know how to write. My English teacher wrote in my high school yearbook that I was the bane of her existence and that I would never amount to anything. That was an exact quote. And I became a book packager, but I was writing, I wasn't an author. And the difference is that anyone who can use a keyboard can write down words. An author, I think, has to have a point of view. An author is somebody who's showing up to make a change happen, as opposed to simply say something that is beyond reproach, say something that is certainly true. Well, while all this was going on and I was starting one of the first internet companies, this magazine ended up on my desk. I used to read Wired magazine every month the minute it came out because it was the future and just mind-blowing. And it being in the internet business before the internet, it was useful. But then Fast Company showed up and I realized that I was one of those people and that these could be my people, that I was most comfortable talking to and about what was going on in that universe. And it became one of the most successful magazine launches in history. It ended up selling for $400 million. Not that that was the point, but to give you an idea of the scale of what you could do with a magazine. And I decided that one of my personal goals would be to write a column for Fast Company. Now, the problem was at the time that Fast Company didn't have columns. And that was an intent on the part of the two founders, Alan and Bill. And I had met them at a conference very briefly. And I wrote them a letter because email was flaky. And I said, I'd really like to write a column for you. Don't worry, I do other things for a living. I just think I have something to share. And I'm becoming an author. Here is something I'd like to do. And they wrote a very nice note back saying, I'm sorry, we don't have columns. And I heard them. And this is the important distinction. I wasn't hustling for a gig. I was trying to be generative and create value. So what I started to do was write a column for Fast Company, even though they didn't have columns. And so it was a monthly, but every week, so 4 times a month, I sent them a finished column ready to go. And after they got the 7th one, I think Bill said to Alan, you know, we got a lot of ads this month. Why don't we run something from Seth? And I ended up writing more words for Fast Company than almost anybody. And I never got paid $1. And it was worth every minute of it.
That story, thank you for sharing that story, because I do think it's going to serve as a metaphor and some lessons for what we're going to dig into, especially when we start talking about the practice, one of your recent books. I love that story. And another thing that is infused through your work is much of your work calls out the industrial system, the brainwashing that makes us feel like we're a cog in a machine versus the artists, the creators, the independent agents of change that we have the potential to be. And I'm not sure if I've heard you talk about this before, but is there a particular moment that sparked that revelation for you or inspired and fueled what feels like a rebellion against the system for you? Was there an origin story with that?
Um, so I almost certainly have mild ADHD. And when I was 15 and the world was young, it was 1975, it didn't have a name and it certainly didn't have any accommodation for it. And as somebody who was operating at a pretty fast cycle, but not particularly focused on detail, I was always in a state of frustration about problems that needed to be solved and interesting things to bring it forward. And one way that I learned as I matured to deal with that frustration was to understand, A, there's nothing wrong with people who are neurodivergent. They're just different than the prevailing system. The system has a problem, not the person. And the second thing is that there is a system. It's not personal. And once I began to see the system, I could find ways to create a situation, the conditions, where I could feel like the person I wanted to feel like. So I remember one summer I had a job doing programming on an IBM 360 in St. Louis. And after 2 days, my eyes were bleeding. You want me to sit here for 5 hours doing this? No. And that was just before lunch. And I realized when I got to college that I could find a loophole in the catalog that would let me take more courses than anybody else and have a major that wasn't really a major. Once I could see that the system had holes in it, I could find ways to be generous. And that was the other part about seeing the system, which is you can hack the system for your own benefit. But if you do that, sooner or later, it's going to catch up with you. But if you hack the system for the system's benefit, then sometimes you get to do it again.
I love that. I love that insight. Thank you, Seth. I'd love to now turn to your book, The Practice, and talk more broadly about your creative work. And so if we turn to The Practice, and it's become a book that we really absolutely love, and we have started to recommend it to writers and those who aim to do creative work. Now, you talk about this in your book. We live in a society obsessed with the outcome. And yet you say the task of the creative is to focus on process, the practice. And you quote the sculptor Elizabeth King, who says, process saves us from the poverty of our intentions. I'd love for you to talk about this idea of practice saving us from the poverty of our intentions. What does that mean?
So when I heard Elizabeth say this, and I'm lucky enough to have become her friend, it was mind-blowing, because we would like to believe that our willpower will get us through. And that's the first myth. And that the second myth is that the work worth doing is the work that has a great outcome, that we get a publishing deal, that we get 5-star reviews, that we get a big advance, that we win the Booker Prize, whatever it is. That when I talked about Fast Company, I told you how much it sold for. That's an outcome. That's not part of the process. And, people ask that hypothetical question, what would you do if you knew you were going to succeed? And I'd like to say, what would you do if you knew you were going to fail? What would be worth doing anyway? And when we become attached to somebody else's opinion of our work, we can't help but flounder. So when we think about the Buddhist idea of attachment, this is really hard for a lot of Westerners to get their arms around. So here's the way I think about it. If you and I needed to swim across Canoe Lake in Northern Ontario, the safe way for us to do it would be to stay about 5 feet apart from each other, keep an eye on each other, and swim sort of in tandem. The unsafe thing to do would be to have a 6-foot rope from my arm to your arm, a 6-foot rope from my leg to your leg. If we are attached in that way, we're both going to drown. And so when one is writing, we are aware that we are writing for someone else. We are aware that there is a purpose to our work, but we are not attached to what will actually happen. We are not spending our time willing the other person to get it. Because as soon as you do that, then you become the stand-up comic who yells at the audience when they don't laugh at the joke. Don't do that. Simply tell the joke. Simply do the work. And what happens is what happens. We can learn from it, but we can't control it.
Have you ever been in a situation where you found yourself getting caught up in the focus of the outcome, where you've been disappointed by an undesired outcome? And if so, how did you focus back on the practice, or what do you tell yourself?
Every single day. Anyone who doesn't tell you every single day is lying. When Annie Duke, who used to be world poker champion, has written a brilliant book about decision making. So I'm going to steal her riff here right now. Think very hard about a great decision you made in the last 6 months. Can everyone who's listening live and the two of you think about at least one great decision in the last 6 months? Okay, so the question is, how did it turn out? Did the outcome work? Was that a big win? And almost everyone says, yeah, it worked. Well, that's not a great decision. That's just a great outcome. You might have made a stupid decision and gotten lucky. And there are other times we make a really good decision and the outcome's not what we were hoping for. And it's still not a bad decision. It was a good decision based on what you knew and what your resources were, but you didn't get lucky. So if you win the lottery, that's a bad decision. Buying a lottery ticket is stupid. Whether or not you win, it's stupid. It's a bad decision. It's not a good investment of time or money. But we justify it because I won. And so when we think about our writing, if you were sloppy in your practice, if you took shortcuts in what you were doing, if you broke commitments to others and you pleased someone in the audience, I don't think your practice was healthy. I just think you got lucky in the outcome. And so if I am in a situation where, whether it's I'm in traffic or in my canoe and it's windier than I thought, I try not to reward myself if I'm lucky or punish myself if I'm unlucky. I try to keep coming back to, based on where I was and what I decided to do, was my practice a healthy one? If it's not, let me make it better. If it was, we keep coming back to the practice.
I love that. I love that focus on the practice. And riffing a little bit off something you said earlier about how every day you're fighting this attachment to the outcome and wanting to refocus on the practice. I wonder if you can share anything around what you say to yourself or any practices you might do, whether it's just journaling out how you're feeling, or maybe you have mentors that you speak to. How do you deal with the negative emotions, maybe even imposter syndrome when it does come to you?
Okay, so we've managed to be talking for more than 15 minutes without mentioning Steve Pressfield, which might be a record for me. If you haven't read the War of Art, I strongly encourage you to do so. Resistance is real. Resistance is anything that gets in the way of us creating the change we seek to create. Writer's block is resistance. Overeating before a big meeting is resistance. Changing your outfit 9 times before you go to a party is resistance. Resistance is everywhere we look. It's to the left, it's to the right, it's up, it's down. And resistance will arise. And when resistance arises, we cannot make it go away. It is a symptom that we are onto something. So when it arises, as we learned from Pema Chodron, we invite it in and have it sit down for tea. Because when we see it and we name it and we welcome it, it loses all of its power. And you don't need a fancy, $1,000 a day writer's retreat. You also don't need a sterling silver ballpoint pen. You simply need to see resistance, acknowledge resistance, and then go back to your practice. Now, a lot of people have a non-functional practice because resistance taught them to build one, where I have to wait till I'm inspired, or I have a block, so I have to wait a week, or I need to have a whiskey or two before I sit down to write. These are non-productive practices. A productive practice says, there's work I seek to do, a change I seek to make. How do I get my butt in the seat and start putting the words down? I can get rid of the bad words later, but how do I do the work and do the work? If we can sign up for that and not bring emotion along for the ride, then the stress goes away. And what we're left with is simply the tension of, I wonder what's going to come from my practice. The tension of, I wonder how I can get better at this. That's generative. But stress, the stress of feeling like this, we need to let that go.
Riffing off this, and this is something that we've taken to heart. And I think just to say also, we've had Mr. Pressfield on this in this community, and we're so grateful for him, and we're huge fans as well. I'm glad we got to mention resistance in him. A thing that's helped us, and you talk a lot about this, is turning the focus away from ourselves and toward someone else. The importance of making things that matter to someone. And for us, there's a listening and there's an attention there involved in knowing who we're serving and what change we seek to make. And we're curious what that and I imagine that there's a listening practice there for you. What does that listening look like to you? Is it simply the inbound that comes through your work, your blog, your books? What are your listening practices? How are you paying attention to the people that you want to serve, and then using that to fuel the work that you end up doing?
Great question. So let's talk about the idea of the smallest viable audience, which comes from the book, This is Marketing. If you say I'm writing for everyone, you're not writing for anyone. That it's inconceivable that there are 8 billion people on earth who need to read what you're doing. If you say you're writing for no one but yourself, I think that's fine. Then don't talk to me about your writing anymore because you're wasting my time. Go off into your dark corner and do something. But if you are writing for someone, let's be clear who the someone is. And that someone is not a demographic. It is not, left-handed 62-year-old basketball players from Italy. It's people who believe something, want something, dream of something, are afraid of something. It's a psychographic. And so the marketing lesson here, which applies to books as well, is for people who believe blank, and there are lots of things that people believe, and who want blank, this thing I'm creating will help them get there. So if you're going to write Harry Potter, maybe 1 billion people know who Harry Potter is now, but at the beginning it was for 100 people. You could specify exactly which 12-year-old kids this book was for. What did they believe? What did they want? What did they dream of? What they were afraid of? Those are the people we need to listen to. And we must ignore everyone else. We must shun the non-believers. And this is why reading your reviews is such a foolish thing to do. Because if someone gives you a 1-star review, all they're telling you is, I am not one of the people you sought to write for. That's all you need to know. But you cannot possibly read all your 1-star reviews and become a better writer. Because what you'll end up doing is becoming an average writer for average people. And that's not the point. So Julie wonders about writing a memoir. There isn't one kind of memoir. It's not a 40-year videotape of everything you did for the last 40 years. It's a narrative. It's a story. And it only wants to be read by people who want to go somewhere. Which people and where do they want to go? We have to know that if we're going to be generous for them. And Fast Company taught me that in a big way. I knew exactly who was reading Fast Company. And I wrote something very specifically that was, will the people who read this rip it out of the magazine, put it in the company Xerox machine, make 40 copies, and put them in those little mail slots at work. If they do that, I wrote the thing I wanted to write. And that was transformative for me.
It's so helpful. And another one of the conversations that happens in this community of, and you mentioned on this, people writing in the dark corner, of writing something as a form of expression. I want to express myself. And when there's a conflict there, and you talk about this in the practice, and you say either is fine, writing for yourself or writing for another is fine, but trying to pursue both is a recipe for unhappiness. And I wonder if you can riff on this a little bit, expound on this conflict, because I do think it's a point of confusion for a lot of us. It might start here, but if it's going to end up there, there's a shift that needs to happen. I wonder if you can expound a bit.
Yeah. So I have a dear friend. I have a dear friend, and she has been making fine woodwork for the last 20 years, like woodwork that belongs in a museum and with an entire shop and everything else. No one, including her husband, has seen 95% of what she has made. No one. No piece has been sold. It's not for them. It's for her. And she gets satisfaction out of that. The minute she tries to sell it, she's signed up for a totally different journey. And you have to pick. So when I'm writing a book, I'm not writing it for me. I already know what's in it. And I'm not revealing my soul, because my soul is none of your business. What I'm doing when I'm writing a book is trying to serve you. And I'm very clear about that. And the same thing's true for fiction, and the same thing's true for how-to books. We should decide. And in our consumption-oriented Western culture, we've made it so that one of those is more important than the other. But it's not. One of them is not more important than the other. So you cannot buy one of my cherry wood canoe paddles. It's not for sale. And I've made many, many of them. Sometimes I give them to people as a gift, but they're not for sale. And I think that some of that work I've done, I would put right next to some of the books I've written in terms of expression of what I needed to do in that moment. But one is clearly commercial and one is not.
I love that. And I wonder if maybe one of the reasons we want to, or we confuse the two, is because we think about external validation. We think about people looking at us differently, maybe people seeing us as successful, maybe even allowing ourselves to feel like we're successful, which brings me to the question, how do we measure success? Right. What metrics can we use, whether we're doing something for ourselves or for an external audience?
Yes, it's a great question. I produced a video with Liz Gilbert for the Acumen Fund. You can find it on YouTube. And Liz, in that video, talks about the difference between an avocation and a vocation. And you might get very, very lucky. And I acknowledge with a capital L that I got lucky. My avocation and my vocation are the same. But it's entirely possible that for you, they're not. And so go get a job. Get a job that is a reasonable way to spend your days and pays you enough for you to do your avocation. And go do your avocation with all of your heart and without holding back. But when we show up and insist that we get paid fairly for the magic that is our avocation, we have done a service to neither of them, because we have corrupted on one side or the other or both.
Love that. We'll make sure to share a link to that Liz Gilbert interview as well in the follow-up. Want to talk about that moment if someone does decide, okay, this is for someone else, and the act of saying, here, I made this, is one hurdle that many of us face, and then there's the other that's, and here's how you can purchase it. Would love to talk about selling, and this is an uncomfortable thing for a lot of people. I know you've talked about this in many of your books, in particular the practice, but I wonder how you coach people who are feeling like they're struggling selling their work.
Okay, so I'm just guessing that there is no one who is engaged with this interview right now, who is sitting there naked with no food in their home, no computer, and no place to live. We buy stuff all the time, and we are happy to buy stuff. That when people talk about feeling icky about selling, What they're really feeling icky about is being hustled. What they're feeling icky about is hustling people, manipulation, which is if the other person knew what you knew, there's no way they'd say yes. We don't like that. We don't like social pressure to say yes to something. On the other hand, we buy stuff all the time because we need something to watch tonight or to read tonight, and we need something to wear to work tomorrow. And so real sales is finding someone who believes that it's okay to pay a lot but get more than they paid for. And to find someone who, if they knew what you know, would eagerly want what you have and would be frustrated if you withheld it from them. That we can get there if we begin with the smallest viable audience and stop bothering the people who don't want to hear from us. I cannot tell you how many times a day I get emails from people who insist that the person they represent would be a great guest on my podcast. Leaving out the fact that I haven't made a new podcast in over a year. And after 250 episodes, I've never once had a guest. So clearly they're hustling me with no research and no care. It's just easier to spam everybody. But when you are able to bring something to the world that they'll be glad that they have, it's a service to sell it to them. Now, writing has changed from a professional point of view in two really significant ways that are related. One is, in the US, the number of books published every year has gone from 40,000 when I started to more than 1 million a year now. So the book shortage is over. And number two, the number of people who actually read a book that they paid for is close to zero. That more than 50% of the people in the United States have not purchased a book since they left high school. Not one. And bookstores have disappeared. When you add all of those things up, the chances that you are going to write a book that's going to be purchased by 500,000 people is close to zero. And that has nothing to do with you. It has to do with the market. I mean, I'll ask everyone on this call, when was the last time you went out and bought a poem? Probably a really long time, because the market for buying a poem is very small. So what are you going to do about it? Well, the first thing I would say is your enemy is not piracy, it's obscurity. That if everyone knew your work, you would have no trouble making a living from your work. The problem isn't selling it at first. The problem is sharing it. Why would someone who touches your work want to send it to someone else? And if you write something, what I suggest to first-time authors is take your first thing that you wrote, probably a book, make it into a PDF, and send it to 100 people who know you. If those 100 people share it, it will spread, and then people will start begging you to write something else. And if no one shares it, you need to get better at writing. That this isn't how do I trick a publisher into giving me money. This is, do people want for free to be able to share this, talk about this, embed it in their lives? And it's easier than ever to do that with words now, between YouTube and TED and everything else. Do we get currency among the group we seek to serve? If we get currency, then we will receive currency. But first, we have to figure out how to share it. That doesn't mean you have to do everything for free. Generous doesn't mean free. It just means you're creating enough value that people insist on paying you.
Hearing you say that, it reminds me, I'm sure Parle too, Pressfield, War of Art. I feel like that's how it started. Here's something, it spread. Julia Cameron learned that as well with her Artist's Way, Artist Recovery. It started with sharing it with a friend, and we all know the story of those two books now. Such a nice reminder. Curious, maybe a little tactical question around pricing, and maybe just your philosophy on pricing. I know for us, it's kind of like, sometimes it's just like putting something out there, but I'm curious how you think about pricing, whether it's a community, a course, a book. How do you think about that?
Okay, so price is a story. That's what it is before it's an exchange of value. It's a story. So if I told you I just bought a $400 pair of sneakers, you have an instinct about what it might be like, and you have an instinct about what kind of person I might be. I have never bought a $400 pair. but the price tells us something without even knowing what the item is. So when we think about, for example, a course, I know people who've taken $3,000, $5,000 writing courses. I promise you, they learned less than they would have learned if they had found 3 friends and worked their way through the practice chapter by chapter for $19. There's no doubt in my mind. But the price had a placebo effect because the price told them that they could tell themselves a story about being serious, about who else would be there, about being the kind of person who spends this kind of money on this sort of thing. So when you lower your price, you're in a race to the bottom. And the problem with racing to the bottom is you might win, and that's no fun, or you might come in second, which is worse. So lowering your price isn't the answer. Being the most expensive isn't always the answer either. But what is the answer to your question is, what is the story this price tells? What does it tell me about what I'm offering? And what does it tell the person about what they're receiving?
Thank you.
I'd love to talk to you, Seth, about fear. You talk about this in the practice, and you have 45 reasons why we sacrifice ourselves to fear. And there are a few that really hit home to me, and I think it resonates with a lot of writers in the community. And maybe I'll just pick on 1 or 2 of them. One of them is talking about the work too early, looking for a reason to abandon it. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that. How do we know when it's too early?
Well, let's think about the people in your circle. Most of the people in your circle care about you. That's why they're in your circle. And for many people in a critic-driven culture, one way to care about you is to protect you from damage. And so when you bring the work to those sorts of people, telling your parents you want to grow up to be a blank, or showing a friend the first draft of something you're doing, their instinct is to say, please don't do this. Please do something safer. Because if I encourage you to do this, I will not be a good friend or parent. If I encourage you to do this and it doesn't work, I'll be on the hook for your failure. So the instinct, and I've invented more than 5,000 ideas in my career, almost all of which have failed. But I know, even though I'm surrounded by people who care about me, that if I show people an idea and they don't like it, I might very well be onto something. That when I got on the internet in 1976, and then again when I was building games for Matt when he was 12 years old, the stuff I was building, all the people in my circle said, what? You have an MBA. Why are you wasting your time doing this? And again and again and again, people are saying, don't do that. And so what I learned is we need to be very specific when we are asking the people around us for their feedback. Because the question we must not ask is, do you like this? Do you think this is a good idea? And the reason is, it's not for them. Right? If you have an idea for a horror movie and your friends aren't the kind of people who go to horror movies all the time, don't tell them, because it's not for them. That when we decide to get qualitative insight from the people we seek to serve, we don't get it by saying, I made this, what do you think? We get it by hanging out with them, seeing their choices, developing empathy, so that we could imagine if we were in their shoes, how would we respond? But when you're thinking about doing something, unless you want to be talked out of it, I don't suggest you tell your closest friends about it, because it's their job to talk you out of it.
That's another one that you talk about, another reason that we sacrifice ourselves to fear, and that's making our work all personal. So conflating the work with us. How do we escape that? Particularly if we're writing something like a memoir, how can we not make it about us?
Yeah, I love this question. Pablo Picasso may or may not have had the following anecdote occur to him. And a gallerist came to him with 20 paintings that he had acquired. And Picasso was looking at them because the gallerist wanted Picasso to validate them because the value would go up. And he said, fake, fake, fake. This one's real. Fake, fake, fake. And the gallerist said, what are you talking about, Pablo? I saw you paint this painting 3 weeks ago. And Picasso said, oh, I often paint fakes. And what that means is my heart is not for sale. And what I am here to do is bring a piece of work to you that will help you. And it may or may not be congruent with what is in my heart and my soul. That's not what we're discussing. Bob Dylan's autobiography, every page has things on it that are not true, that did not actually happen. Because someone who was buying Bob Dylan's autobiography wasn't looking for Walter Cronkite's version of Bob Dylan's life. They were looking for this lyrical story. And if all you're going to do is give us a recording of all your keystrokes, not very many people are interested in that. I think what people are interested in is their imagined experience with the thing you are creating. And it says more about them than about you. And where this became a trap was when the internet started doing social media, because the way you got views was by bleeding on stage. The way you got views was by having a meltdown. The way you got views was by saying, I'm just being authentic. Authenticity is nonsense, just nonsense. No one wants you to be authentic unless you're a diva or a boxer. For everybody else, we want the best version of you, not the version of you that's crumbling right in front of us.
I really love that section of your book, Authenticity is a Trap. I recommend it. Seth, would you be up for talking about your writing process a little bit? Just a few questions around.
It's going to disappoint people, but sure, bring it on.
And
I promise it's going to disappoint people.
My disclaimer is that, you know, we ask this knowing that all writers have a different process, and we understand that. But as writers, we are nosy about other people's writing processes and curious to see what works for you. I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about, you can choose any one of your books, but maybe the practice. What did the first draft of writing this look like? Do you plan it beforehand? Do you simply write as you think and then edit it later? What does that first draft look like for you?
Okay, so here's the trap. The trap is there are people on this call, not my friend Tanya, but some, who believe in talent. There is talent when it comes to slam dunking a basketball. There is talent at some level, maybe, when you have perfect pitch. But there is no talent in writing, because if you know how to speak out loud and have other people understand you, you have all the talents you need to write. What there is skill. And skill is something you learn to do. Talent is something you're born with. So when someone says, how long did it take you to write The Dip? And I say 17 days, they're like, oh, you're a very talented writer. But if they say, how long did it take you to write Survival is Not Enough? And I say, well, actually it was 9 hours a day, 6 days a week for a year. And I had to delete 225,000 words when I was done. Well, now I sound like somebody who's, I don't know, hacking his way out of a cocoon. So which is it? And the answer is, it's whatever lets you do your craft with skill. And the way that I create the conditions to do my craft with skill have varied dramatically through the years. And I see different ones work for different people. Here's what I've helped 25 non-writers become New York Times bestsellers as a hobby, as for my friends, to sort of talk them through what that would involve. Sometimes it takes a long time, sometimes it doesn't. But they're paralyzed before they come to me, sometimes for months, sometimes with a $500,000 advance already in the bank, and they're still paralyzed. And we go out and we buy a $19 tape recorder. And I say, here's what we're going to do. You're going to hit record and we're going to go for a walk. And you're going to tell me in the course of an hour what you would tell a stranger about why you want to write a book in the first place. And almost everyone I know is capable of doing that to a generous listener. Tell me for an hour why you even think you have something to say. What is it you want to say? And then after the hour is up, they've probably said 10 or 15,000 words. And you send it to a transcription service, and now for $9 with AI, they send it back to you. And all you have to do is edit it, and it's done. And this is how we bypass resistance. This is how we get past all of the stress and simply have a practice. And I learned it from Isaac Asimov. I can't believe I knew Isaac Asimov. I can't believe I worked with Isaac Asimov. He was 70-something. I was 24, 26. And I sat in his living room in New York City, and I said, Isaac, he was an egomaniac, so questions like this always worked. I said, Isaac, you have written 400 books, published 400 books. What's your secret? And he walked me over to this old typewriter. And he said, Seth, every morning I sit down at 7 in the morning and I type until noon. And it doesn't matter if it's good. I just have to keep typing. And he said, when I do that, my subconscious realizes if I'm going to type anyway, I might as well type something good. And at the end of the day, I get rid of all the words that don't need to be there, and then I'm done. And if you have skill, that's all you need to do. The question is, what do you have to do to create the conditions to have skill?
I think we have many in the community who would love to go for a walk now and take on some of these ideas.
I think we might have a new practice within
Walking
this
and writing.
community.
Yeah.
Speaking of practices, so we've touched on this a little bit, Seth, but we are a community of practice, and that phrase, I think I learned from you. I know you probably learned it from someone else. I forget who it was.
Kristen and I were in the room together when she started talking about it. So I'm giving her full credit, but I would not have let her leave the room until we had created a program together.
So we're a community of practice, and in particular, we have a drumbeat that we do every day. We've been doing it since March 2020. It's called Writer's Hour, and for 1 hour, hundreds of us get on a Zoom room and we write together in silence. We've been doing it every Monday to Friday, showing up, holding space. Thanks to many of our hosts now, we do it 4 times a day, 20 times a week, and just want to share that because we're proud, and I think actually your ideas, unconsciously or consciously, have helped spur that for us. So thank you for that. And it's how many of us in the room have come to be a community and how we're able to be here today. And there's a quote that you say, I think this is from the practice. When you're surrounded by respected peers, it's more likely you'll do the work you set out to do. Find your cohort, the generous ones. We've been so lucky to have that here. So thank you to everyone here in the room with us. But we're always trying and wanting to make it better. And I'm curious, as the leaders, the holders of this space, I don't know if it's advice, questions you might ask us, how can we continue to foster a generous culture of writers in this space?
It's a really good question. Part of the magic of the Fast Company community was that Alan and Bill created the kind of community you're talking about, that you could walk into their office in Boston and walk out with 6 months worth of energy. Whereas if you walked into the offices of where they used to work, the Harvard Business Review, you would walk out needing a vacation just to get back to normal because it was so competitive and elbowy and edgy. I've been part of conference communities where there are high profile people, and I don't go to those anymore because resistance was so real. Imposter syndrome was so significant that no one could find space to help other people because they felt like they would be caught out as someone who didn't really know. And we see this a lot in things like medical conferences where surgeons need to figure out where their status is and aren't always giving each other the generous hand that they could. So the discipline, and I run purple.space with some wonderful colleagues. The discipline is to figure out who you're going to amplify and who you're going to ask to leave. That when you curate who is in the room, you are changing the community. And if it turns out that the person who is loud and selfish gets the prizes, don't be surprised if you end up with people who are loud and selfish.
Thank you. I'm letting this sink in. I think it's probably one of the things is challenging too, and going back to it's not for everyone. And when we have had to say, maybe this isn't for you, that's a hard thing to admit, because you want to help everyone, but it's a nice reminder that you can't.
Yeah, a great reminder that actually it makes all the difference, as Seth was saying. Wonderful. Well, I'd love to talk about how to end projects. We noticed that writing in community is one project that you sunset, and we're curious about, and maybe you can talk us through whatever you're comfortable sharing, why you decided to close that and maybe more broadly, how you choose which projects to stop, seeing as you have so many going on.
Well, I write about this in the dip, which is you can't start something unless you're prepared to end it, because you're not going to wear ballet slippers when you're 50, and you're probably going to get rid of your Cub Scout badges as well. So it's bittersweet for me to launch something, because when I launch something, I know that I'm one significant step closer to finishing it, to being able to having to say that's the end of that. And if it's a commercial project, it's much easier to make the call, because you can say this isn't generating the yield it needs to for the effort that's being taken. But most of my projects are art projects. Sometimes there's a commercial component, but I'm not sitting here saying, how do I get the maximum yield per day? So when online learning was young, I looked at massive online courses. I saw that they had a 97% dropout rate. I saw that there were these amusements like Masterclass that taught nothing to nobody. And I thought maybe there's a way to do something better. So I went into the desert in Utah with the express intent of figuring it out. And 4 days later, I had developed the Alt MBA. And the Alt MBA went on. It's now still thriving with more than 5,000 alumni in 90 countries. And I built it with a team. And around the time that COVID hit, I was dealing with some health challenges, but also I knew that my contribution to it couldn't remain the same, because I had built it so that I didn't have to be in it live. It wasn't sit at Seth's feet and learn something. It was a community of practice. And after the Alt MBA, we developed the Writers Workshop, the Podcasting Fellowship, and a whole bunch of other online courses that were different and better than what most people had done for the kind of people we were seeking to serve. And so what we did was we made the entire entity into a B Corp in the public interest, and some of my employees took it over. I don't own it. I don't run it. I have nothing to do with it anymore. I sunsetted that project for me. And if they had needed advice, I would give it to them, but I had nothing to do with it. And what happened recently was the Alt MBA continues, but all the other workshops, they sunsetted. And it wasn't because they weren't working, and it wasn't because they weren't profitable. It was because focus is in short supply. What is the project you will seek to do next? And if we look, whether it's Miles Davis or Chuck Close, artists change what they do, because we are not plumbers. If you want to be a plumber, that's okay. I think it's fine to make a living as a plumber. But if you're an artist, you need to start projects, and that means you need to stop doing them too.
Thank you for that. I want to riff on this a little bit, continuing on the projects that you've created. And there was a quote that you shared in the Song of Significance. It's quoting Ben Zander of the Boston Philharmonic. And reading this, I'm like, oh, this is what Seth does. The conductor of an orchestra doesn't make a sound. He depends for his power on his ability to make other people powerful. And when we look at from the outside your projects like the Alt MBA and the Carbon Almanac, which was a fantastic feat, everyone should check that out, rallying thousands of people to put together a book, a hopeful book on the climate and how we can make change. I imagine you're using this quote to fuel you and to making other people powerful. And I'm wondering, what does making other people powerful look like in practice? You mentioned handing over Alt MBA to your employees who run it. Riffing on any of that, maybe the Carbon Almanac, Alt MBA, what does that look like philosophically, tactically, to make other people powerful?
Yeah, meeting Ben was a key part of growing up for me. Before that, the ice under me felt thin enough that I needed to demonstrate that I had a solution to whatever problem was out there. And talking with Ben, being his friend, seeing what he's capable of doing. And he, in the book, The Art of Possibility, talks about his transformation. He was the crankiest of all cranky European conductors. He was not, he was Leonard Bernstein-ish. And the thing is, it's a discipline now for me to figure out where those white spaces can lead. Because I know, having bootstrapped for so long, that I could probably dive in and do any paragraph of the Carbon Almanac or any chart maybe this much little better than somebody. But that wouldn't have gotten us, a 97,000 word book with no errors in it that was translated into 8 languages and won worldwide award. It would have just made my ego feel better for 5 minutes. And if the goal is to make a change happen, creating the conditions where that change can happen, that's hard, but that's the point. Maybe you're a solopreneur and you create the conditions and you do all the writing, but maybe not. But that's your choice. But we're here to make a change.
Thank you, Fallon.
Thanks, Seth.
I'd love to switch to talking about AI. You've been a keen experimenter of AI. You've fed an AI engine your voice to record a podcast for you. You've been feeding it your blog posts. And as you can imagine, within the community, there are a range of opinions about AI and how this might impact us and our writing. And I'm curious about how you're thinking about it, and maybe about how you think writers in our community could be thinking about AI.
So in Europe, in the salons of the 1800s, people were absolutely beside themselves and furious about cameras. Because if cameras caught on, who's going to need a slightly above average portrait painter? And the answer is nobody. And so that went away as a profession. But it didn't hurt one bit the kind of person who wanted to become a fine artist. And we can go down the list over and over and over again. When recording studios go away and you can record everything in your bedroom, well, some musicians said that's wrong. Those people aren't real musicians. But the listeners didn't care. And if you are threatened by AI, then either you are misunderstanding the power of your own writing, or you're not a very good writer. That AI instantly replaces mediocre radiologists, mediocre pharmacists, mediocre copywriters. There's no reason to hire any of those people because AI can do it faster and cheaper all the time. And so if that's the kind of work you used to do, and I did 120 books as a book packager, some of them in the old days, I could have done them in an hour with an AI if I had had one, but there wasn't one and there wasn't an internet, so they needed me to do it. But now it's different. So it opens the door for you to say, it's really silly for me to work on anything mediocre now, because there's no market for anything mediocre and it will not fuel me either. So if it can be done by AI, walk away from it. And if you can figure out how to use AI as an editor, because it's really good at that, Claude.ai, upload 5 chapters of your work to Claude and say, Claude, please tell me if there are any internal contradictions or sloppy word usages or repetition here. And 12 seconds later, it will. It's not always going to be right, but it's going to be more right than that person who lives next door to you who's got an axe to grind. The point is, the typewriter made it so it was really hard to be a calligrapher unless you're great at it. And AI is going to make it really hard to be a writer unless you're great at it.
Thank you, Seth. So just a quick time check. We have about 10 minutes left. A couple more questions from us. We're going to land the plane here. And if we do have any more time, we will maybe ask 1 or 2 questions, but we'll see where we get to. So Seth, having followed your work for well over a decade, I see someone with a deep sense of purpose, and someone who's clear on their place in the world, who has identified where their uniqueness, their gifts, their skills meet the needs of the world. That's at least my perception from the outside here. And I'm curious, would you describe that for yourself, that you feel like you've found your place in the world? And I'm curious what that journey, if there was a moment where you were enlightened about that place and that journey for you. I'm curious.
Well, it's very nice of you to say, but I'm not sure I agree with you.
Mm.
I think that after most of us, if we're physically lucky, turn 3 or 4 years old, we can walk around the world with confidence without thinking about the fact that we're getting up and walking over there. And I also know that many of us were born with an unfair amount of privilege compared to everybody else. and we get the benefit of the doubt just by walking into the room. And because I have written enough words, it's like the walking part. I don't have to doubt my ability to say something. I write like I talk like I write, and mostly I talk in complete sentences that make some sense. That's just a skill. And the question I need to wrestle with all the time is this benefit of the doubt that I have earned because of timing more than anything else, right? That having a blog that was #1 in Google for blog for 6 years, that's just luck. Someone had to be #1 and it happened to be me. What are you going to do with the benefit of the doubt? What are you going to do with the fact that my family will be able to eat tomorrow night, whether or not I get a gig? And so, no, I don't believe that I have figured out much of anything. I do believe that my obligations to the work have increased, not decreased. And that because I have the ability to show up and have people give me the benefit of the doubt, I have to push myself, not coast. And there are plenty of projects that I need to do that I'm not doing because I'm afraid of them. There are causes that I need to support more consistently than I have, and change that I need to make. Every time I hear a leaf blower going on in my neighborhood, it's like a small knife to the heart, because thousands of us worked for a very long time on the Carbon Almanac. The truth is clear, and yet we're still not getting it. And so there's a lot to do. But yes, I don't worry about going out of business anymore. I used to worry about that every day for 15 years. It's good to not feel that way.
Appreciate your answer. And on the note of all the many things that you could be doing, is there anything that you're particularly excited about right now, or that you're keen to focus on, maybe in the next 6 months, 6 to 12 months?
Well, I'm working on a new software project. I'm working on a casual game that's better than Wordle. That's been fun to do. And Purple.space fills me with joy every time I interact with it, watching that community grow. It's mostly about helping people teach other people something useful, because the first order connections we have are much, much smaller than the second and third order ones. I'll give you one tiny example. I'm not going to get the names right. If you go to 500songs.com, it's an astonishing podcast, History of Rock and Roll in 500 Songs. And each episode used to be an hour, but one was 3 hours and 45 minutes a couple of weeks ago. And he's tracing from the beginning where music came from and how it came there. Turns out there's a guy whose parents were introduced to each other by the Prime Minister of the UK, and whose father was going to be knighted. I mean, super fancy guy who grew up to play the trombone in the 50s. And he became obsessed with American blues. And he is the only person who brought the records over. And he used his standing to spread the idea that there was this roots music in the US. And if it weren't for him, there wouldn't have been the Rolling Stones. And if it weren't for him, there would, and when you listen to the Beatles talk about the music they listened to growing up, it's all because this one person did that. And the entire course of all the music we know was influenced because one person cared a lot about an idea and spread it. But he didn't spread it to the Beatles. There were 3 steps in between. And that is what we're all capable of doing.
Thank you, Seth. And I wonder if anyone who doesn't know about Purple.space, whether you could talk about it?
Okay, so what I learned from the Almanac, I built a version of an open source community on Discourse, and it enabled us to have asynchronous interactions, not like the chat that's been so generous going by where it flies by, but it's stacked and it's categorized and it's horizontal. And it was so useful for all of us that I didn't want it to go away. So we built another one called Purple.space. That's the URL. And it's expensive, but you get more than you pay for. And it's a thousand people who support each other in their work, whatever their work is. They tell each other the truth. They establish masterminds. They post dailies. They go through some of the workshops I've built together. And the things that this community is able to come up with are so far reaching, because I'm not telling everyone what to do. And every couple of minutes, there's another post 24 hours a day, and you will find people who are looking for you, or you won't. And so half the people who join leave within a week, and the other half are in it for the long haul.
Thank you, Seth. And we'll share links to all of these. Last couple minutes, how can we support you in your work? Where's the best place to go? Any shout outs you want to give?
You already know
folks?
the answer to that, right? This is the point, that the fact that this group exists, that's why I'm here, because Ma and Pa, they really call you Ma and Pa? That's hysterical.
It's because of Matt and Parl, not because
it's both. It's both.
It's
anyway,
both.
Everyone wants to talk about their new book. My new book is deeply personal. My new book changed my life. It came out last May, called The Song of Significance. Hopefully it will resonate with people. But I don't have anything to sell. That's not my point.
Well, thank you, Seth, so much. We're so grateful again for you, the work that you do, you continuing to show up. We would love to give you a London Writers Salon round of applause, not only from Ma and Pa, but also from this wider community. So if you'd like to turn your video on, if you'd like to unmute yourself, let's give Seth what we got here. Thank you, Seth, for being here.
Thank you, Seth.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Keep making a ruckus. We'll see you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Seth. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here at this interview. Wow. What I feel like I can exhale. It's funny when you get to meet your mentors and your heroes. So
yeah, I think we've been pretty nervous about this one. I want to do a shout out to Gary and Pamela as well. Matt's parents are in the crowd.
My actual mom, Pa.
Hey,
well, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, we love this.
Thanks, Dad. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. We're so grateful for all of you. Let's keep this thing going. Our community of practice. We're so grateful. Onward and upward. Our next Writers Hour, it's in 45 minutes. So maybe see some of you there. What else, Parl? I think
that's it. Thank you so much. As always, these interviews are special because you come along. Really, it's so special that you came along to this interview. Have a lovely, lovely rest of your day. We don't see you.
And if this is your first time with us, we'd love for you to join more things. We do interviews like this just about every week. We also do our daily Writers Hour. So hopefully you'll join us. We'll send links out and the recording shortly in a couple hours. All right. Until next time, friends, lots of love. Keep going. Make a ruckus, as Seth would say. Bye.
Bye.